This little bottle contains an absolute miracle. It'll help you start your day off feeling great and with a ton of energy, even if you've had a couple of drinks the night before. Zbiotics.com/reach, you'll get 15% off. There would likely have been no Donald Trump if it weren't for Rupert Murdoch. There would also likely have been no Rupert Murdoch if it weren't for Ronald Reagan. And there probably would not have been a Ronald Reagan if it weren't for Roy Cohn. Yes, that Roy Cohn, the one that helped launch the career of Donald Trump, also helped launch Rupert Murdoch into the United States, and he also helped Ronald Reagan become the president of the United States. Roy Cohn, not very well loved by many people, but he certainly had a hand in power and knew how to connect people. His cousin, Dave Marcus, spent the last 6 months of Roy Cohn's life shadowing him. He's also here to share what he knows about Roy Cohn and Rupert Murdoch, and how that alliance, an alliance with Ronald Reagan, helped launch the Rupert Murdoch empire in the United States and ultimately landed up bringing us Fox News. Quite an achievement, especially considering the news today, when we are discovering that the anchors at Fox News were peddling lies on behalf of the management there, Fox News, about the Dominion voting machines, about 2020. But we know that they've certainly been spreading other lies, whether it goes back to the coronavirus or you name it. They've certainly been aware that they've been peddling in untruths, to say the least, to the American public. Amongst those documents that we saw this week from the court testimony was Rupert Murdoch's very own testimony. And it's really interesting for me to be able to read about what was going on inside this organization, inside this news organization, which has been given the opportunity to be truthful to its audience, to be of service to its community by providing good information, solid information, the kind of stuff we get trained to do in journalism school. Instead, these guys have gone on the air and basically lied to their audience, basically provided a full narrative about a voting machine and about Dominion as a company and about all sorts of weird international connections with the Chavez, or you name it, just an entirely made up conspiracy, like he was spending the night in Rudy Giuliani's head or something. And there it is, night after night on Fox News. And now perhaps it's time for them to pay up. Rupert Murdoch's deposition was really interesting because he did not, in fact, say that he did nothing wrong. He just did what he did the other two times that he's had a major scandal. Back in the 1990s in the UK, he was involved in another scandal. This is the hacking scandal. Remember they hacked into the phones of all the royal family, celebrities, and a bunch of other people? They got into a bit of trouble for that. Not as much trouble as they got into in 2013 when that scandal came back for a second time. Only this time we realized that they were hacking the phones of victims of crimes, which just seemed like a step too far. And they were paying off all sorts of other local officials, court people, you name it. They were just going above board, being corrupt, and also just not performing as an ethical newsroom should perform. Now, those two scandals, 1990s one and the one in 2013, involving News of the World. Certainly, Rupert Murdoch, in his defense of both of those scandals, did the same thing. In the UK scandals, he blamed his newspaper editors, he blamed his reporters. Those are the ones who got in real trouble. They were the ones who had their homes raided in the early morning and had to be dragged off into police stations because of these various scandals the newsroom had been involved in. But it is beyond Rupert Murdoch's capability to accept that he is personally responsible for any of these things, or his company is personally responsible. So what he tends to do is do the same shtick he's done the last two times, and he's doing it again now. He gets to blame all the anchors. Those 16 anchors, they all did that. But I had no knowledge. I didn't know. I wasn't coordinating it or anything like that. And of course, we know that can't really be true because he was so close to the White House. He was so close to Jared Kushner. There's just not a chance that he didn't know what was going on and they weren't coordinating messages. There's real criminality in these cases. There's an actual coordinated corruption scheme in order to lie to the American people, as there was in the 90s in the UK to hack the phones, a scheme. These are not your typical newsroom hijinks. You don't normally get, and I've spent a lot of time in newsrooms in my life, you don't normally get scandals involving the entire newsroom. You get scandals involving one reporter, two reporters, I don't know, maybe someone falsified some information, maybe someone lied about a story, maybe they got a fake interview, maybe they got paid to add some information to a story. Those are the typical kind of scandals you get in newsrooms. Very rarely do you get entire news organizations all somehow saying the same thing, pretending to be the truth to their audience when they're not, and not doing that in a coordinated way. That just seems ludicrous. It seems ludicrous that there wasn't some coordinated scheme. So for him to go around blaming each of his anchors for doing what they did meant the anchors themselves would have been stuck in a room back there, not consulting with anybody else, not telling their directors what they were doing, not telling their writers what they were doing, just making up full-on stories about Dominion, even though it had no backing from anybody. It's ludicrous to suggest that it didn't belong to the entire organization. It doesn't belong to Rupert Murdoch himself directly because he's so connected to the Trump White House. That in fact, this is the only way that you can justify a story being so extensive in an entire news organization is because it's connected directly to the powers that are benefiting from it. And in this case, we know that Rupert Murdoch was benefiting directly, and so was the White House benefiting directly from that mutual relationship that Murdoch had with the Trump White House. There was a letter that came today from Hakeem Jeffries and the Majority Leader Charles Schumer in the Senate, expressing their distress at what they're finding out from Rupert Murdoch in this deposition. It really is a well-written letter that deserves a little bit of a read here. So let's take you through what they said. As noted in your deposition released yesterday, this is to Rupert Murdoch, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, and other Fox News personalities knowingly, repeatedly, and dangerously endorsed and promoted the big lie that Donald Trump won the 2020 presidential elections, that you have acknowledged your regret in allowing this grave propaganda to take place. Your network hosts continue to promote, spew, and perpetuate election conspiracy theories to this day. The leadership of your company was aware of the dangers of broadcasting these outlandish claims. By your own account, Donald Trump's election lies were damaging and really crazy stuff. Despite that shocking admission, Fox News hosts have continued to peddle the election denialism to the American people. This acts as a dangerous precedent that ignores the basic journalistic fact-checking principles and public accountability. This is even more alarming after Speaker McCarthy is reputedly allowing Tucker Carlson to review highly sensitive security camera footage of the events surrounding the violent January 6th insurrection. And it closes by saying Fox News executives and all other hosts on your network have a clear choice. You can continue a pattern of lying to your viewers and risking democracy, or move beyond this damaging chapter of your company's history by siding with the truth and reporting the facts. We ask that you make sure that Fox News ceases disseminating the big lie and other election conspiracy theories on your network. It is in fact true that they continue to peddle these stories. They haven't in fact even acknowledged that this court case is going on to their audience. Howard Kurtz was being told by his bosses that he can't even mention this case, and he's the media guy at supposedly a news network that is now banning coverage of its own stories, the stories relevant to itself. So it doesn't look to me like they're going to change that policy. We're not going to soon see it on Fox News. But at some point, it seems to me that Rupert Murdoch is going to have to go up to Dominion and offer some sort of settlement. $1.6 billion is a lot. He's clearly in a lot of trouble, despite his admission that he's done it. So at some point, we should expect that there will be an apology on the air, that there will be all the anchors saying, we lied to you and we apologize for lying to you. But then what? What do you do with an organization that's been so heavily crippled after that? And you can't have any of those anchors back on the air because they're just known for lying. It's interesting to note, just for Speaker Jeffries and also Senator Schumer, the more you talk about each individual anchors, you're falling into his trap, into the Fox trap. I haven't gone to trial yet, so you got time here. But what you need to keep pressing on is the fact that it's the whole of Fox News. It's not just anchor 1, anchor 2, and anchor 3, because that is what their defense is going to be, that it's just the single anchors who got in trouble, that it's not the entire organization, and it's certainly not Rupert Murdoch. Reading Donald Trump's reaction to all of this, he's telling Rupert Murdoch to get out of the news business, which is hilarious because the only reason that Donald Trump is in the politics business is Rupert Murdoch. There's no doubt about that. But twice today, he went on a bit of a rant to Donald Trump. This is basically because Rupert Murdoch's admitting that Donald Trump's ideas that he won the election were crazy stuff. I think that got Donald Trump a little bit upset. So that's why we saw that. And we ought to remind everyone how close Jared Kushner was and is still to this day to Rupert Murdoch. And these are not just friends. These are not just colleagues. Jared Kushner, when he started his career, when he first started moving into Manhattan, it was Rupert Murdoch that helped him really expand his property empire into Manhattan. Rupert Murdoch has been his mentor for decades, since the early 2000s. These guys are very close to each other. Every day when Jared Kushner was in the White House, Rupert Murdoch would call him every single day. They'd discuss things, they'd discuss advice, there'd be discuss strategy. Is a very close relationship. So when you're talking about Rupert Murdoch, you are also talking about the Kushner empire, and you are also talking about the entire Trump White House, because in fact, I don't believe it's possible for there to have been a Trump White House if it weren't for the interference, if you will, of Rupert Murdoch and also his ex-wife, Wendy Deng. Wendy Deng and Rupert Murdoch were close to both Ivanka and to Jared, which makes for an interesting scenario when you're thinking about potential influence by foreign companies. It could be quite possible, in fact, that Wendy Dang was a Chinese spy. And if she was a Chinese spy, maybe she was influencing her husband or ex-husband to do some things on behalf of the Chinese state. And who knows if that's the way they were able to get Jared and Ivanka to be so compliant. Speaking of Chinese spies, here's a clip from Steve Bannon, who describes the day that Rupert Murdoch was first told, apparently, by Ivanka Trump that her father was going to run for president. This is Steve Bannon describing what Rupert Murdoch's reaction was to that news from Ivanka Trump. It's quite funny.
No, he's not. And she goes, no, you don't understand. He is. He really thought this through. And he goes, no, he's not. And she goes, no, he is. He mumbles in the soup, no, he's not. And that was the conversation. It didn't change a lot over lunch. Murdoch, to me, should have been the guy above all that understood how you actually communicated to a mass audience, particularly communicated to a working class audience. And he was, it seemed to me at the beginning, the most anti-Trump of all.
He certainly changed his mind. And then after a while, we found out, of course, that there was an alliance that had been built between Jared Kushner and Rupert Murdoch, that they would help each other in getting Donald Trump elected. In fact, that's what we saw. And we also saw in 2020, now revealed through these Dominion filings, that there was another deal struck between Rupert Murdoch and Jared Kushner that included giving Jared Kushner all the information they needed about Joe Biden's advertising plans that was released to Kushner ahead of the last election. So you can see that it's certainly not an alliance that ended with one election, that they continued into the second election. We'll talk to Dave Marcus about all the interesting things his cousin did in setting up the lives of Donald Trump, Rupert Murdoch, and Ronald Reagan. Now, I should say that this is it's a family member. This guy's talking about his family member. The guy's talking about his cousin. He spent the last 6 months of his life, Roy Cohen's life, shadowing Roy Cohen. He's a person who knew him quite intimately. We're talking about 1986 when he died. You're going to be interested in hearing what he has to say. He certainly has got not the most flattering things to say about Roy Cohen, but it's fascinating to hear someone who knows him so well, who understood his mind and how he operated, the system on which he built. And it's brought to you by ZBiotics. You can wake up without feeling gross after a couple of drinks the night before, just by using this prebiotic called ZBiotics. Here's how it works.
Drinking alcohol produces a toxin called acetaldehyde. It's this toxin, not just dehydration, that causes the worst morning after effects of drinking. Using genetic engineering, we built a probiotic that breaks down acetaldehyde. We started with a natural probiotic bacteria found in a Japanese superfood called natto. Then, we altered its DNA so that it produces an enzyme that breaks down acetaldehyde. This is similar to what your liver does, but our probiotic does it better. After spending a year building a prototype, we put it into a drink with this hypothesis. Before drinking alcohol, you drink our probiotic, and it works in your gut throughout the day and night, breaking down acetaldehyde and setting you up for a great next morning.
ZBiotics, check them out at zbiotics.com/reach. You'll get 15% off. It's a great deal. It really is a great deal. The stuff really works, by the way. It's not one of these fly-by-night things. It's an actual scientifically proven product, and it will make you feel better the next day if you've had a little too much to drink, or even if you just had 1 or 2 drinks the night before. Sometimes I can get pretty hungover from that. So just that could work for you if you want to try zbiotics.com/reach. It's worthwhile as we talk to you about Rupert Murdoch to bring you back into understanding the trajectory of Rupert Murdoch's career. He certainly began in Australia. That's where his life as a newspaper mogul began. He's a very enigmatic man who really was able to storm Australian media scene and develop a pretty impressive stable of newspaper assets while he was there. He soon found that even limiting for himself. So by 1969, he decided to branch out into the United Kingdom. And he bought the News of the World and soon afterwards the Sun. And that later became the highest selling tabloid of the UK. This experience of him moving from country to country is pretty rare. You don't often see media moguls establish themselves in Australia and then move to the United Kingdom and then move to China. It's very rare for these kind of media moguls to leave the borders of which they're confined to, because the media business is such a local kind of business. It often is driven by local interests. It's fascinating that Rupert Murdoch was able to start in Australia, get such a massive, impressive start, and then was able to ultimately move his media empire into a British empire and to buy these incredible assets, the News of the World and the Sun, both spectacularly important ones. In 1973, Just 4 years later, he's trying it again. This time he's trying to get into the US market. And he buys the San Antonio Express News, a good newspaper, no doubt, but not like the best newspaper in the country, but a good newspaper, a nice mid-market newspaper to get your feet wet with, if you like. Murdoch buys this thing in 1973, and he's already doing a lot of global expanding for just a small Australian company that was already a little bit over-leveraged. For them to be buying up properties like this in countries in the UK and the US and diversifying their interests across so many different continents is really interesting. Very unusual strategy, actually, when you think about it, unless you've got a ton of money in the backing of maybe other interests. It all happened at a rather interesting time. 1973, of course, Watergate was the big story. 1974, Nixon resigns. And it's after Nixon's resignation that we have the Church and Pike commissions, both of those commissions recommending that the CIA curtail its intelligence operations, especially its black ops operations. In other words, these are the things that were really secret. They didn't want to do that anymore. It might be the case that the CIA was told not to do it. That's true. The CIA was told not to do it. It didn't stop the White House from doing it, which is what they landed up doing when it essentially brought us to the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, it may be surprising to all of you. It was a surprise to me that Rupert Murdoch is, in fact, a little bit involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, as is every major person in the news who is still in the news today from that period of time, seems to have been touched somehow by the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, Murdoch bought the New York Post in 1976. He held onto it until 1988. He had to sell it then because at that point in America, there were still rules about how many newspapers and TV stations you could own in market. There used to be that you could only own 1 or 2 TV stations and 1 or 2 newspapers. You couldn't own the entire spectrum because if you did own the entire spectrum, you might get something like Fox News where you get just one voice in the stratosphere of a certain part of the country, and then that's all they believe. He had to sell it in 1988, but of course, because, as we'll find out from Dave Marcus, because of the rules changing in favor of people like Murdoch, he was able to buy the New York Post back in 1993. That's how he spent his 60s and 70s, how he spent his 70s at least. Let's tell you then what happened right after this, because in 1981, News International buys the Times and the Sunday Times, giving them almost 40% of the British press, which is this is in the UK. It's another impressive feat. I don't know how the regulators there quite work, but for them to be giving 40% of the British markets to News International, including the Times and the Sunday Times, pretty impressive. Now we jump forward to 1983, and there's a small note in the CIA files that reflect Murdoch's movement. They tell us that in 1983, Murdoch had a very unusual dinner with the head of the CIA, William Casey, at the time. And that dinner was also joined by Charles Z. Wick, who was, at the time, USIA director. So it was a CIA notice that in 1983, Murdoch dined with William Casey. And then we find out later on what that means, because just a few years later, we discovered that there was something called Project Democracy. You see, when the CIA was told that they couldn't do any of their black ops anymore, the White House thought, well, what are we going to do to replace that? So they came up with this thing called Project Democracy. And Project Democracy was a fairly large enterprise. It was run by Oliver North, amongst other things. And it had a front side, which faced the public and was basically a funder of NGOs and opposition groups around the world. And it had a covert side where they did all sorts of dirty ops, like sell arms to Iran or whatever it is they were choosing to do on any given day of the year. It coexisted under the banner of Project Democracy, but they were very different. There was an open, well-known public version of this, and then there was this covert version of this. And this is really interesting that Rupert Murdoch was one of the funders of Project Democracy. We know that because Project Democracy was intended to be both a public organization and a private organization, because the money had been cut off by Congress. So the CIA no longer had access to all these black ops funding that they'd previously had. The White House had to seek funding elsewhere. And they did that by going to billionaires or millionaires at the time, I'm not sure what they were, who were interested in this kind of world. Amongst the people who had dinner with Charles Z. Wick and the CIA director, Casey, at the time, these are the millionaires and billionaires. Sir James Goldsmith, publisher of L'Express, the French magazine, W. Clement Stone, a Chicago businessman, and Rupert Murdoch. And we're told by very good sources that Rupert Murdoch was, in fact, the funder or one of the funders of Project Democracy. Why did he do it? Did he do it because it helped just his newspaper empire grow? Who knows? Did he do it because he was funded indirectly by other people. Who knows? That's also possible. We do know that in 1982, things weren't going so well financially for Rupert Murdoch. He had almost become bankrupt in Australia. So it seems quite bizarre that he would have money to throw at something as obscure as Project Democracy. But he did. He did. And then in 1983, he became one of these funders of this sometimes illicit covert operations that happened as part of the Reagan White House, which ultimately, by the way, of course, included the Iran-Contra affair. So it's interesting. A timeline of, by the way, of everything that happened with Project Democracy. So in June 1982, President Reagan announces Project Democracy in a speech to the British Parliament, saying its purpose is to foster democratic ideals in authoritarian regimes. Early August 1982, a White House memorandum calls for re-examination of the law in order to permit covert action on a broad scale by the National Security Council under this project. This is important because what they were trying to do is run this entire operation instead of running it under the CIA. They were going to run it under the NSC, which is quite naughty, but they seem to have gotten permission to do that from the Congress. In 1982, the White House excludes the Central Intelligence Agency from the program for fear that the CIA participation would confirm suspicions that the project would be used to cover covert activities. In 1983, President Reagan signs National Security Decision Directive number 77, permitting the NSC to coordinate Project Democracy activities. In 1983, the wealthy business executives are invited to the White House. We just told you about that, for the purpose of soliciting money for Project Democracy. And then in 1983 as well, McFarlane is appointed National Security Council advisor, and he then names Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to head the Project Democracy's covert arm. In 1983 as well, Congress approves the first financing for the National Endowment for Democracy after the Director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, pledges in public that the agency will not be involved. So it's the National Endowment for Democracy, which I think still exists today, which funded Project Democracy. December 1984, now it's years later, the first known delivery of weapons to the Nicaraguan rebels or Contras under Project Democracy leaves Lisbon for Honduras. And then in spring 1985, Lake Resources, the Dolmy Corporation, and other Project Democracy companies are chartered. August 1985, the White House acknowledges that Colonel North had been aiding the Contras. And in November 1985, a White House memorandum calls Lake Resources our Swiss company and says one of the airplanes had just delivered weapons to the Contras. And so it goes. So you get a sense of how, at the time, the Reagan White House, and of course, George Bush being the former head of the CIA, now vice president, had experience in covert activities. We know that it makes sense for him to then want to launch a NSC-type project, or Project Democracy, or covert activities project, which he could then oversee from the White House. Makes a lot of sense to me, at least. That's how that sort of evolved. The next part of the story is really about how Roy Cohn introduces Rupert Murdoch to Ronald Reagan. And it's a great story, and it mostly revolves around these photographs here. There's Reagan. I'm not sure the dude in the back there. It does look really familiar, but I can't remember who that is. There he is, a very young-looking Rupert Murdoch in what we believe is 1982 or 1983, meeting the President of the United States. Rupert Murdoch just owned the Post and then San Antonio Express News, so he certainly felt himself a player, but not the kind of player that he would land up being at the end of the Reagan White House. That just certainly was going to be a much bigger enterprise for him. And there's Roy Cohn. Just 4 years short of his death, Roy Cohn died in 1986. That is him just 4 years earlier, making this introduction. We'll hear from Dave Marcus about how connected Roy Cohn was and how important it was for him to play in this favor business. It's really important what happens in 1985, because even though, again, Rupert Murdoch was supposedly short on cash, somehow he buys 20th Century Fox. And with that 20th Century Fox comes much greater assets across the United States, of course. And then in 1986, he buys Metro Media, which includes television stations in Chicago, Dallas, Houston, LA, New York, Washington. And then he launches the Fox Broadcasting Network. This is very significant because, again, the rules up until that point had stated that you could only have 1 or 2 newspaper interests in every market. People did not want a single mogul owning everything in the market. But in 1986, those rules were amended. This is as Roy Cohn was in his last months alive. Next time on Spy Murdoch, Dave Marcus joins us.
Roy Cohn was an evil genius. He was mover and shaker like we'll never see again in the United States or most countries. He also, unfortunately, was my cousin.
Roy Cohn and Rupert Murdoch had an unlikely alliance, one that would shape the world for decades to come. Cohn was the diminutive, self-loathing gay political figure who imbued the very corruption of the American political system. He gained notoriety on a national level as the right-hand man of anti-communist crusader Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin. Their Un-American Activities Committee destroyed the lives of many entertainers and artists under the banner of fighting communism. 70 years later, Murdoch's Fox News' relentless and endless prosecution of libs and wokeness is the spiritual successor of McCarthyism. The stakes are far higher today, of course. Democracy itself is on the line. But the strategy? It's as old as time. Divide and conquer. Roy Cohn had many photographs with celebrities, but one was held in pride of place on Cohen's desk. It's a photograph of Cohn introducing President Ronald Reagan to Rupert Murdoch in 1983. It was the start of an alliance between the three men in which politics, media, the mob, and influence collided. 3 decades later, we are beginning to understand exactly what that alliance meant. David L. Marcus spent the last year of Roy Cohn's life shadowing Cohn for a Vanity Fair article he was writing. It's the kind of access that's really hard to get, unless you're Cohen's cousin, and David L. Marcus was Cohen's cousin. He's our guest tonight.
Roy Cohn was an evil genius. He was a mover and shaker like we'll never see again in the United States or most countries. He also, unfortunately, was my cousin, my dad's cousin. He was someone who influenced U.S. policy for decades. There's been nothing like it for years, and I don't think there ever will be. He meddled with organized crime, the Catholic Church, Washington, the FBI, and of course, Rupert Murdoch, media moguls. But the important part of my story is that Roy was my father's first cousin. My father abhorred him, hated him, and wouldn't speak to him. And I just want to be really clear about this. So I did talk to Roy. I interviewed Roy. I hung out with Roy. I had no love for Roy, for his shenanigans, for his crimes. But what you're referring to is a magazine story, a Vanity Fair story I wrote about shadowing him for the last year of his life and watching everything fall apart. I did not feel bad for Roy by any means, but I'm fascinated by these characters who rise and frankly get too close to the sun and ultimately get scalded, get burned, as Roy did, as I think Donald Trump is going to do. But Murdoch amazingly has avoided that.
It's interesting for you to tell us who he was, because he certainly seemed like a connector of many worlds. You know, in my mind, he was a part of the mob, certainly. He was part of this incredible world in the 1980s with of these rich, elite New Yorkers who were living this fantastic life, and also connected to politics and power. That's a very alluring nexus to be in the middle of. And yet he was able to achieve it. So regardless of whether you admire his actual actions or his work, the achievement of being in the middle of all of that, triangulating that, if you like, is quite remarkable.
I can't think of anybody who had so much influence on U.S. policy and politics for decades. And Roy was born in New York and lived in Outer Borough. And his father was a judge, and Roy wanted power so much. He was the only child, and he sat at his parents' dinner table and partook of conversations as if he were an adult. He was a little prince. And by the time he was 19, he had graduated from Columbia University Law School. He was graduated from law school too young to actually be admitted to the bar. He had to wait for that. And just a few years later, he was on the national scene, and he had gone from a proud Democratic family to being what we would now call a Republican. He wasn't really alive with the Republican Party yet, or conservative, or even like a proto and early MAGA person. He went after Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in his early 20s. I think he was 23. A lot of people don't know them. They were accused of being Soviet spies, and they were put in the electric chair at Roy's urging. Roy basically had illegal conversations with the judge who sentenced them. Roy basically demanded that they be found guilty and electrocuted. Nobody else was as spies. And really, frankly, what they did was incredibly minor, especially Ethel, if anything at all. And yet Roy got away with that. Roy then went on to be the chief counsel for Joseph McCarthy, who was a really, frankly, stupid, drunk, power-hungry senator in Washington, who found that by bashing the army and by bashing so-called gay influence in the State Department and elsewhere, he could really get headlines and get power until, of course, he got too close to the sun and burned.
There's a sense of a man who would do anything for power, but he's not alone. There's certainly a lot of people in the world, and it certainly exists today. That is their primary focus, is power and money. And he might have been a prototype of that, an early prototype of that. Do you fault him for that? Do you fault him for his desire for power? I have a grudging sort of admiration for people who just do that because they are nakedly ambitious.
I crave power too. I go to New York and nobody gives me a parking space. Nobody gives me tickets to Yankees games. And Roy was the ultimate power broker for years. I was in his office many times when he called George Steinbrenner, then the owner of the Yankees. You get incredible seats for his friends. And for my grandma, who was really his beloved aunt, he would make sure he got her amazing stock seats in Broadway shows. And he connected Roger Stone with Ronald Reagan. He connected Murdoch, who we'll talk about, with Donald Trump. He connected Reagan with the power brokers in New York. That's how things work. I'm not naive, but he also was a lawyer and an advisor to Fat Tony Salerno, a mafia boss, to a couple of cardinals in the Catholic Church in New York. And it goes on and on. He played all sides.
Dying of AIDS, when you're considered a proponent of Ronald Reagan's policy of ignoring the disease, what was his position on AIDS?
Roy Cohn was gay and openly gay. I say openly because in those days, the media was very circumspect about certain influential people's private lives. I was at his house when there was basically orgies were about to go on and things that my view is people's private lives, it's their private lives, as long as they're consulting adults, I don't care. But Roy Cohn espoused something totally different. He was a gay basher. And so you miss something, which is before we can get to the AIDS policies of the 80s, in the 1970s, Roy was driving the New York City government to go after gays. He was in the 50s, he was driving the U.S. Foreign Service to root out gays, to closet homosexuals, whatever. He was open, he was gay, and everybody around him knew it. We'll talk about J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was a confirmed bachelor, as they called them in those days. Senator Joseph McCarthy was too. I don't believe in conspiracies, but there was an orbit of men who appeared to be gay, and Roy certainly was gay, and that's fine, except that they were also arch conservatives who were gay bashing, and not just gay bashing, they ruined people's lives. People were driven to commit suicide, fathers, because they were outed as gay, whether or not they were, by Roy Cohn and by Joe McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, and others. So there was a really evil, despicable tone to what he did before we even get to the AIDS crisis.
He died in 1986. So a few years earlier, I guess, this picture took place. This is him introducing Rupert Murdoch to Ronald Reagan for the first time. And that's Roy Cohn there on the very right in the second photo. Tell us a little bit about it. If you know his condition then, was he already sick at the time, or is it before he was diagnosed? And then do you know very much about how this happened? How did Roy Cohn get to introduce Rupert Murdoch to Ronald Reagan?
Okay, so I believe that second photo is 1983. I think Reagan and Rupert Murdoch met in person at the White House. But let me back up for a second, if I may. The Reagan-Rupert Murdoch connection actually started before that. Roy Cohn was shamed in Washington in the 50s and came back to New York, where anybody else would be under a bush, would disappear. But in fact, his power only rose, Roy Cohn's power rose in New York, so much so that he helped Donald Trump, another sort of refugee from the outer boroughs. And this is the important part. Murdoch, I think, he moved to New York in 1976. And this is a time when Roy Cohn was at the apex of his power. And soon after that, Murdoch bought a beloved liberal institution, the New York Post. And New York started page 6, which was a sleazy gossip page in the New York Post. Now, Roy Cohn was a frequent contributor to Page 6. He represented celebrity clients. He was in the middle of rich people's divorces. He would feed gossip to Page 6, and they in turn would feature him a lot. Roy had this crazy antenna, this crazy way of finding people who were on the verge of becoming rich or powerful or making it in society. Not good people, by the way, usually, but people. And Roy really tended to Rupert Murdoch in the late 70s when he had held all this power. A call from Roy to somebody would stop a lawsuit. A call from Roy from somebody would stop a newspaper investigation of the mafia in a concrete business. A call from Roy would fear people. He was not a good lawyer by any means. He's been written about as a great lawyer. That's not true. He was a great connector. He was a great threat maker. He was a great lawsuit initiator. He represented Studio 54. I went with him several times there. It was the hot club where they were money laundering. There was openly cocaine sales. What happened in the men's room, I'm not going to tell you, but it was something for my little teenage eyes. I had rarely described the things I saw, and I'm not going to do that today. You can let your research run well. What happens in the women's room, I can only guess, but the men's room was quite a scene. But Roy was in the middle of all this stuff, and here was Rupert Murdoch, an outsider, a press mogul, media mogul elsewhere, nothing to show in the United States. Roy completely opened the door for this horror that became the Rupert Murdoch we know today. Ronald Reagan was launching his run for the presidency. Ronald Reagan was a really unlikely candidate. And I'm telling you about Reagan because Reagan ultimately, as you implied, as you figured from that photo, Reagan gave Murdoch, he bestowed on Murdoch special favors that without those favors, Murdoch would be nothing. He would be the owner of a little money-losing tabloid in New York, be nothing in this country. Reagan was a little known. He was a governor from California. No trajectory, nothing would hint that he would become president of the United States. But Roy fractured the Republican Party in New York. And I won't go into all the details, but basically he gave Reagan an opening to move into New York and to get votes in New York. He connected Roger Stone, who had worked for Richard Nixon. Roger Stone became like a money man for Reagan, raising money, as did Roy in New York. Roy raised millions of dollars for Ronald Reagan. Didn't even know him at first, but he found something simpatico. He liked his kind of arch fake conservatism. Reagan came from Hollywood, had gay friends, but Reagan was anti-gay, anti-abortion. Roy was gay, had friends who had women friends who had abortions, men friends who didn't have abortions, but did everything else. And Roy was the connector with those two. And ultimately, he got Rupert Murdoch to take the once liberal Post and endorse Reagan in the primary in New York, which was important, and to write favorable stories about Reagan that paved the way for the start of this Reagan, Rupert, Roy triumvirate.
Yeah, it's very unusual for an American president to have an alliance with a publisher in the way that Reagan had with Rupert Murdoch. And it was an alliance that was really brokered by your cousin. And there's this one letter. Roy is basically complaining to various people at the White House, including Ed Meese, James Baker, complaining about the fact that Ronald Reagan never attended a requested interview in Boston.
It was in Boston, you do.
It's not the kind of letter you'd think you'd write to the president of the United States or any of his staff. There he went and wrote this. So just a couple of paragraphs that really stand out. I had one interest when Tom and I first brought Rupert Murdoch and Governor Reagan together, and that was that at least one major publisher in this country, New York Post, over 1 million, third largest and largest afternoon, New York Magazine, Village Voice, San Antonio Express, yada, yada, would become and remain pro-Reagan. Mr. Murdoch has performed to the limit up through and including to today. I enclosed the editorials from the 3 New York papers so you can see how the Daily News and New York Times blasted the president's speech and how Murdoch's New York Post gave its whole editorial column to high praise for it. It goes on to say, Mr. Murdoch has been deeply disturbed at what he regards as the failure to stand by some basics in the president's original program, which he believes to be correct. His advice is consistently sought by Mrs. Thatcher and Prime Minister Fraser of Australia, in both of which countries he owns extensive media interests. He is not the kind who is offended when his advice is not taken, but he does appreciate being treated courteously and having at least the same courtesies extended to his Washington reporters as seem to be heaped upon his opposition. He's hurt by the way the Boston matter was handled, and there is just so much that Tom and I can do. A remarkable insight into the man's brain and his ability to work both sides. Really, he is working both sides in that. He's doing a great job working on Murdoch's behalf and on Reagan's behalf. And somehow you could see how he'd become a very important person in that relationship.
This letter is actually really well written. It's really frustrating to me because Most lawyers cannot write a letter that tells a story in a page. He did. And you'll notice, by the way, it says delivered by hand to the White House, right? So this tells us so much about how things work. And another letter that Roy sent to Reagan was talking about Murdoch. Quote, tempers are so hot that I would wait for things to cool off. Now, that was a subsequent another time when Roy felt Murdoch had not been treated well enough by the White House. This had an effect, by the way. This is not just some grumpy middle-aged person writing to the White House. This went right up the chain of command.
Very good point. That's Edward Meese, I think, that's signing that. Please do.
Reagan and Murdoch did not know each other personally back then, but Reagan's people knew that Murdoch had endorsed Reagan for that election a couple of years before, that Murdoch had openly slanted his news pages to be pro-Reagan. And this kind of ironic and silly was for me because I worked for the Boston Globe. And if you read it, I think he calls it the violently liberal or violently democratic Boston Globe. Thank you. That was my employer.
Violently anti-Reagan, in fact.
A few years later, that was my employer. Murdoch had been working for Reagan, but Murdoch was just a publisher of a New York newspaper. There was no such thing as Fox News then. But what happened after was a chain of events, which was, I think, linked to these letters and certainly linked to Roy's constant badgering Reagan. Murdoch was welcomed to the White House soon after. Then, incredibly, the government, our pace, immigration service, and others sped up everything. So 2 years later, I believe it was, Murdoch became a naturalized citizen. Does that matter? It mattered incredibly back then because it meant then that he was a naturalized citizen. He was not a foreigner. He could own a TV station in the United States. He bought a TV station, and that led to Fox. That was also just the start of it, thanks to Roy. There were very strict rules then about you couldn't own in the United States a TV station and a newspaper in the same city. Very sensible rules we had then. Amazingly, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, under Reagan's handpicked puppet, Mark Fowler, they did a Murdoch rule. They basically loosened that so that you could have a TV station in New York and the New York Post. Then they went further. They let you own several TV stations. Then they went further. Reagan's people made it so that the fairness doctrine that we had was thrown out the window. The fairness doctrine meant that you get a TV station. It was not like a newspaper. You had special power. There's limited numbers of licenses for TV stations. They were precious. You had to give equal opportunity to different sides of an argument. Made a lot of sense, but they threw that out. And of course, with Murdoch's journalism, which was really propaganda, that was perfect for him. That was the opening for Murdoch to become Murdoch. That was the opening for Fox to become Fox.
Yeah, it does seem to me that there would be no Fox News or no even News Corp in the way we know it today if it weren't for Ronald Reagan's easing of those regulations, which it seems to me like he was doing in exchange for this very stuff that Roy Cohn is describing in these letters, this exchange for favorable write-ups in these newspapers. It seems like a bad deal on Reagan's part, but I guess if you're short-sighted about these things and you think you just want to get through your next term, why not make a deal with the devil like that? Do you know if there's anything more to it than that? It's a remarkably lucrative deal for Rupert Murdoch, but was it lucrative for Roy?
There's no evidence that I ever saw, and I've followed Roy around for a while, that Murdoch was actually generous to Roy in the way that people are to their connectors, fixers, lawyers, in terms of millions of dollars, in terms of huge payments. Murdoch was a friend of Roy's. Murdoch was a client of Roy's on a small scale, but Roy believed in what a journalist called the favor bank. So, Zev, you get me tickets to the opera and I'll get you my friend's private plane. The favor bank. Murdoch's newspaper, the New York Post, covered Roy and his people in a very favorable way, extensively, especially on page 6, which everybody turned to in New York. And remember, again, for your younger readers, it's just a newspaper, right? It wasn't Twitter, it wasn't Instagram, it wasn't TikTok, but it was the New York Post and its competition, the Daily News. People were on the subway, they read those. At parties, they read those. In the weekends, you would go to get together with people in the evening and they would refer to what they saw in page 6. It sets the agenda for sort of social coverage because there was no social media then. Roy was social media. Roy was the expert at getting things to go viral, although nobody called it that.
In my days of working as a network producer on morning television in New York, The first thing I did when I got into the office, the very, very first thing I did was page 6. It didn't matter what was the headline on the front page of the New York Times. I had to know exactly what was in page 6 because it did say it could change your day. So absolutely, that's the kind of thing that people did point to. But you talk about the favor bank. Behind the scenes of Rupert Murdoch's empire, as we were trying to piece it together, Rupert Murdoch was in trouble actually in the 80s in Australia. He was nearing bankruptcy, overstretched himself. He reorganized somehow. And it seems like Allen and Company was the company that sort of came on board, and he got a new director in Mr. Schulman. There is some speculation that perhaps was a helping hand there from either the Rothschilds or the Israeli intelligence world. That was a lift that they gave Rupert Murdoch so he could start his entree into the United States. And that it would make sense in that regard that Roy Cohn would be one of the people who would help him out in that way.
That would not be unprecedented with Roy Cohn. Roy had incredible contacts in the government, in conservative parts of the government. All the stuff is coming out now about Robert Maxwell, right? The opposing publisher, if you will, to Rupert Murdoch, and what kind of intelligence ties he might have had. What we do know is this, and this is really important, and it does hint at what could have been going on with Roy and Rupert. Roy Cohn in the 50s was very close to J. Edgar Hoover. When the FBI released very redacted files a few years ago, it was shown that Roy was writing J. Edgar Hoover, just as he later wrote Reagan, for favors, for do this, you need to know this, for smearing people's names. And J. Edgar Hoover, people don't know probably now, but he was the head of the FBI for years, and he was a very sleazy person. If you think of FBI, we hope they're upstanding and they're impartial. Hasn't really worked out that way. But J. Edgar Hoover was blatantly a political person and anti-communist. But that's the thing that I want to talk about. Murdoch is just like Roy. Murdoch's politics are transactional, right? His beliefs are transactional. It's who's paying him, who's helping him, who's opening doors for him. And Roy was like that. Roy was a Democrat by all means, by a name anyway, for years, from a Democratic family. And yet he was endorsing Republicans. He was doing underhanded things to destroy Democrats. He was gay, but he was destroying gay people, and not just bashing them, as I said, but actually looking at policies and laws that undermine them, ruining their lives. And J. Edgar Hoover, as I said, there's a lot of suspicion he was gay, cross-dresser, whenever, all kinds of things that have been alluded to. But these guys, when their intelligence matters, that's cash, right? That's better than gold. The information, Roy always knew that. Roy did not have a dime to his name for most of his adult life, if you really looked at it the way we measure wealth.
Yeah.
And yet, because he did favors for mafiosos, for Yankees owners, for whatever, for Rupert Murdoch, there was always a private jet available. There was always something, private plane available. There was always a house in Mexico waiting for him. And Murdoch, I would believe anything you told me at this point about where Murdoch got his information and who he traded information with. How the hell did he get from being a publisher in Australia and then Britain, and owning one newspaper in New York, to being a billionaire who's on the side of the Russians, as far as we can tell, who's Wendy Dang, you could more than I do, but there's a lot of interest of where Wendy Dang's Chinese interests are, where her spy interests are.
He's almost definitely a Chinese spy. I've said it out bluntly. Clearly, that's the game that Rupert Murdoch plays. He will find the power brokers in a society. He'll find a way in. If people think that did Wendy Dang use Rupert Murdoch, it could be that Rupert Murdoch used Wendy Dang because he wanted access to the Chinese market and he knew he could get it through her. And in some ways, I could think of Roy Cohn as the same kind of character, even though he's not necessarily an agent or a spy of any countries. He was enough of a connector that Rupert Murdoch would have used him, or vice versa, to get what they needed. And
we're symbiotic. You use me, I use you.
Yeah.
Don't, as I said, Trump, Donald Trump, case number one, transactional. It's what you grease my back, I'll grease your back. And with Roy, though, it was about access, it was about fame, and it was not about money. With Murdoch, it's about money, and it was about power, and it was about control of the media, which he got, and which we're all suffering from. Interesting little tidbit that I always wonder about. I'm a fan of the HBO series Succession.
I'm too.
It's loosely based on Murdoch.
Yeah.
So what is the last name they give that family?
Oh gosh.
Logan what? Logan what?
Logan Roy. Oh, that's interesting. Good point.
I always wonder if there's like a play on Roy Cohn in some ways, but that's just me.
I've known some people in that kind of world, in those kinds of families, and that's the way they operate. And many of them do, this sort of patriarchal figures that are just power hungry and wield their power with such complete contempt. So I don't even know if how loose that is about Rupert Murdoch's world or just about this sort of billionaire class. But the thing about Murdoch, which I'm doing this whole series, is the guy is now engaged in just propaganda. He's basically just brainwashing the minds of Americans, and he's only nominally an American. So who's he doing it for? And if he's just doing it for the money, there's not that much money in Fox News that you would actually put up all that risk. So there is definitely a component of the money is coming with requests that he operates in a certain way, that he broadcasts certain things that are dangerous and untrue, or he's somehow a real agent of a foreign government of some sort, which is using, but maybe he's actually fully committed to them, to cause damage to the United States of America through this propaganda, through this brainwashing. I don't know the answer to that question, but as we travel through some of this stuff, there was a closeness between the CIA and Rupert Murdoch, certainly because of Ronald Reagan. He introduced him to Casey and others. And as you point out with Edgar Hoover there as well, that sort of ended in the 1990s. That romance ended with a hacking scandal in the UK. And then I think he was left looking for a dance partner, and he landed up in the East with China and with Wendy Deng as his support base there. And that might explain to people a little bit more about where all the money is coming from right now that's keeping that organization afloat, but also where some of this crazy editorial is coming from. It's largely beneficial to China and Russia more than anybody else.
For him to keep growing, the U.S. is a limited market for media and everything else. But China, 1 billion plus people, Russia, they are playing him, I'm sure of it, and the Middle East, and they're playing him and Jared Kushner. And what does China have? What does Russia have? They have intelligence, they have secrets to offer, they have markets that are closed to anybody who doesn't have connections. And Murdoch is being taken advantage of while he's taking advantage of that.
They've been described to me as constructs, these sort of Elon Musk figures that are, not really who they are. They say they're a certain person, but they really are working for somebody. In this case, in Elon Musk's case, probably the Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. In Rupert Murdoch's case, maybe he's taking orders from China. Not that it's completely selfless. It's not like he's working for the Chinese state. He's doing it because he's gaining money. He's just doing what he needs to do to keep the companies afloat and make sure his children get a legacy. But I do think that there's something even deeper and more rooted to this that is an anti-democratic push, and that he's part of this alliance. And I see him and Elon Musk sitting together the other day at the Super Bowl, when I see Jared Kushner being friends with Wendy Deng, all these very close relationships between these sort of power brokers that are vastly anti-democratic. There's something going on that we're beginning to see. I call them the enemies of democracy. And the more we identify them and the more we are able to name them, the easier it's going to be to beat them.
2006, Jared Kushner, really a remarkably unremarkable young man, bought the New York Observer, a mediocre newspaper. But who was his mentor? Who was his guide to turning Jared and the paper conservative? Rupert Murdoch. And then Jared and Ivanka and Murdoch, and then wife number 3, I think Wendy, would go out to dinner, would hang out all the time. And then even after Wendy and Murdoch split, 2 women were friends, Ivanka and Wendy, and Jared and Murdoch were friends. And then I was just reading this the other day. There's a $300 million nest egg set up for Murdoch's daughters with Wendy. So who was a trustee for that for a while?
Ivanka Trump.
2017. All kinds of sexual harassment allegations against Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly. And then the Trump White House, the Trump FCC is helping Fox News, which is in trouble, by getting rid of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, who's looking into these allegations, I think, and by loosening up even more these FCC, Federal Communications Commission, restrictions on TV stations and so forth. You asked me about Roy Cohn. So Roy was my father's cousin, and I'm fascinated by what he taught me about power, about exchanges of favors. It's not always about the money on the surface. It's often about what can happen years from now. Rupert Murdoch knows how to play the long game. He does a favor for somebody and it pays off in ways we don't even know years later.
Is it case closed on Rupert Murdoch? Was he really a Chinese asset all along? Not by a long shot. So you'll have to join us in the next Spy Murdoch, when our investigation takes us back to 1983. David L. Marcus is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author who's covered global events, education, politics, and of course, Roy Cohen's last year alive. He also coaches teens on how to get into their dream schools. You could find his work at davemarcus.com. That's davemarcus.com. The next Spy Murdoch will be available exclusively at patreon.com/narrative or our premium YouTube channel at youtube.com/@narrative TV. Membership starts at $5.